Tonight we begin with a revelation that U.S. intelligence officials had tracked, feared, and ultimately prepared for. A disclosure that unfolded not over months, but in a matter of weeks. Weeks that exposed critical gaps in Western intelligence assessments. Weeks that revealed how deeply Putin has embedded his next strategic phase. Weeks that forced former operatives to break their silence. What Vladimir Putin has done in recent months crossed a line that the CIA and its allied agencies had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, one former agent decided he could no longer stay silent. He responded with clarity, urgency, and a warning that few in Washington want to acknowledge publicly. His name cannot be disclosed. His 23 years inside the Central Intelligence Agency cannot be erased. And what he revealed in our exclusive interview has implications that stretch far beyond Ukraine, far beyond NATO, and directly into the calculations being made right now in the Kremlin. Tonight, we bring you his words, unfiltered, unedited, and deeply unsettling. For nearly 18 months now, there had been signals, not official intelligence assessments, not formal diplomatic communications, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been predictable in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a rhythm that analysts could anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and the Pentagon this spring was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence operatives who monitor Russian military movements and political communications know the indicators. The positioning of strategic assets near key borders, the rotation of command personnel in sensitive regions, the unusual diplomatic outreach to non-aligned nations, the sudden reduction in interceptable communications. All of that went quiet, and whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Our source, the former CIA agent who agreed to speak with us, was among the first to notice this pattern shift. He had spent over 2 decades analyzing Russian strategic behavior, and he recognized the signature. There's a difference between silence and stillness, he told us. Silence means they're planning. Stillness means they've already decided. What I saw was stillness. That distinction, he explained, is one the CIA has struggled to convey to policymakers. The intelligence community can track movements. They can intercept communications. They can analyze satellite imagery down to the square meter. But what they cannot do, and this is the part the agency won't publicly admit, is accurately predict when Putin has made an irrevocable decision. Early this spring, U.S. intelligence detected what they described as unusual strategic repositioning, including the movement of tactical nuclear assets that had not been relocated in over 14 years. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation readiness, strategic deterrence messaging, or preparation for a fundamental shift in conflict posture. Western analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Putin was changing his strategic calculus. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by marginal degrees, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. Our source was direct about what this means. The CIA won't say this publicly, but internally, there's a growing recognition that Putin's next move isn't about Ukraine anymore, he said. It's about restructuring the entire post-Cold War order. Ukraine is the vehicle. It's not the destination. He described briefings he received before his departure from the agency. Briefings that painted a picture of Russian strategic planning extending not months, but years into the future. What Putin is doing now is laying groundwork, he continued. He's testing NATO resolve, he's measuring response times, he's identifying weaknesses in Western decision-making processes, and he's finding plenty. The warning issued by our source tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after source described Putin's current phase as calculated, patient, and perhaps most importantly, insulated from the pressures that typically constrain world leaders. Putin has created a decision-making environment around himself that is essentially impervious to internal challenge, our source explained. The people who might have counseled caution, the economic pragmatists, the diplomatic traditionalists, they've either been marginalized or silenced. But strategic patience only works if the target hesitates. NATO, according to our source, has hesitated. In fact, the Western response over the past year has been among the most fragmented we've seen in modern alliance history. Here's what we know. Within weeks of detecting Russia's strategic repositioning, the United States convened emergency consultations with key allies. These weren't the routine diplomatic exchanges that happen at scheduled intervals. These were crisis-level discussions, the kinds of conversations that only happen when planners believe they may be facing an imminent inflection point. The problem, our source noted, is that different allies have different risk tolerances, and Putin knows exactly how to exploit those differences. Tonight, our source confirmed that U.S. intelligence has identified at least 7 distinct Russian initiatives that, taken together, suggest preparation for a major strategic escalation. These include enhanced nuclear readiness protocols at 3 previously dormant facilities, accelerated production at arms manufacturing sites that had been operating at reduced capacity since the Soviet era, diplomatic overtures to nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America that have historically maintained distance from Moscow, cyber operations targeting infrastructure systems across 12 NATO member states, and perhaps most concerning, the establishment of what our source described as shadow logistics networks designed to circumvent Western sanctions entirely. The West thinks sanctions are working, he said. They're not. Russia has spent the past 2 years building alternative supply chains that bypass every restriction we've imposed, and those networks are now operational. He detailed how Russian operatives have been establishing front companies across multiple continents, creating financial channels that Western regulators cannot trace, and stockpiling critical materials in locations that fall outside traditional surveillance coverage. In other words, Putin has been building infrastructure for sustained conflict, the framework that would make prolonged confrontation viable. This is what made our source's warning so urgent. Putin's current moves aren't just symbolic, they're foundational. They represent the kind of preparation that could sustain Russian operations for years if left unaddressed. And the West, according to our source, has been slow to recognize the scope. Not because of intelligence failure, not because of technological limitation, but because of institutional reluctance. The CIA knows more than it says, he told us. The gap isn't in collection. The gap is in communication. There's a reluctance to tell policymakers things they don't want to hear. And right now, nobody wants to hear that we may be heading towards something bigger than Ukraine. And here's where the story becomes even more troubling. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's latest moves were designed to test the cohesion of NATO after 2 years of sustained pressure. Putin wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under economic strain, domestic political pressures, and war fatigue. But instead of finding a weakened adversary, he found something more complex. NATO didn't collapse, but it didn't strengthen either. It maintained a position that was neither firm enough to deter nor flexible enough to negotiate. That's exactly what Putin was looking for, our source explained. He wasn't expecting NATO to fall apart overnight. He was looking for exploitable inconsistency, and he found it. You don't get Putin's attention easily, but in 2024, NATO's internal divisions did. Intelligence officials speaking under anonymity describe Putin's assessment as calibrated opportunism, a way to identify which pressure points yield results and which meet resistance. Putin is patient in a way that Western leaders are not, our source continued. He thinks in decades. We think in election cycles. That asymmetry gives him enormous advantage. But our source also noted something that hasn't been widely discussed, Putin's own vulnerabilities. His military has suffered significant losses. His economy, despite workarounds, remains constrained. His domestic population, while largely controlled, is not infinitely patient. The question isn't whether Putin is strong, he said. The question is whether he's strong enough to sustain what he's planning. And that's where the intelligence gets complicated. As our interview continued throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Russia's strategic preparation. Russian military planners have been conducting exercises simulating conflict scenarios that extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. Russian diplomatic personnel have been establishing back channels with governments that have traditionally aligned with the West. Russian cyber units, operating from locations across multiple time zones, have been mapping critical infrastructure vulnerabilities in systems that control power grids, water treatment facilities, and financial networks. This wasn't just intelligence gathering. This wasn't just routine espionage. This was target development. This was preparation. And preparation is the one thing that Western intelligence has struggled to adequately counter since the conflict began. For every defensive measure the West has implemented, Russia has adapted with something that complicates the response. We're playing defense on a field that keeps changing shape, our source observed, and Putin is the one redrawing the boundaries. Remember, Putin thought the West would lose interest after the first year. He thought economic pressures would fracture European unity. He thought American domestic politics would shift priorities away from Eastern Europe. But tonight, the exact opposite dynamic is emerging. Western attention has persisted longer than Putin anticipated. European unity, while strained, has not collapsed. And American involvement, despite political turbulence, remains substantial. Yet our source warned against optimism. Persistence isn't the same as strategy, he said. The West has stayed engaged, but it hasn't developed a coherent long-term approach. Putin has, and that's the gap that worries me most. What makes this moment so critical and so unpredictable is that Putin's latest moves happened at a time when he is under multiple forms of pressure. Military hardliners want more aggressive action. Economic pragmatists want negotiated settlement. Security services want expanded domestic control. International partners want assurances of stability. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a conflict that has lasted longer than he publicly predicted. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. That's what the CIA won't say out loud, our source emphasized. Putin isn't escalating because he's winning. He's escalating because he needs to change the trajectory, and that's actually more dangerous. A leader under pressure, with nuclear weapons, facing limited domestic constraints, operating in an information environment he largely controls, that combination creates risks that are difficult to quantify. The intelligence community's internal assessments, now circulating among senior policymakers, were designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian strategic advances to proceed unchecked. Officials said plainly that Putin's recent actions were inconsistent with stable international order. That is diplomatic language for, "We see what you're doing and we're not going to pretend otherwise." You don't usually hear that tone from the intelligence community unless something serious is at stake. Our source confirmed that similar assessments have been shared with NATO allies, creating what he described as the most intensive intelligence sharing environment since the early days of the conflict. But sharing intelligence and acting on it are different things. Information is only useful if it leads to decision, he noted. And right now, the West is drowning in information while struggling to make decisions. Meanwhile, Putin himself addressed Russian security officials in a televised address that Western analysts have been dissecting. He said, "Russia's security cannot be subordinated to external demands." He said, "Those who threaten our sovereignty will face consequences they cannot imagine." And he said, "We have prepared for every scenario. Our adversaries have not." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who has demonstrated willingness to act on his declarations. Our source watched the address carefully. When Putin speaks publicly, he's not talking to his domestic audience, he explained. He's talking to us. He's telling us what he's prepared to do. The question is whether we're listening. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest moves weren't isolated. Along with strategic military repositioning, Belarus has increased its integration with Russian command structures. Iran has expanded its military cooperation agreements with Moscow. China has intensified diplomatic support for Russian positions in international forums. North Korea has reportedly provided material support for Russian operations. All of this happened within the same 6-month window. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. He's building a coalition, our source said. Not a formal alliance, but a network of states willing to challenge Western dominance. And that network is more developed than most people realize. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major offensive in the coming months, designed to achieve decisive military results before potential political changes in the West. Another is that Putin is attempting to freeze the current conflict, consolidating territorial gains while building strength for future operations. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to escalate beyond conventional conflict, using nuclear signaling or hybrid operations to fundamentally change the strategic environment. But today, our source took that speculation further. The CIA doesn't want to admit this, but there's a fourth possibility, he said. that Putin has already made decisions we haven't detected, that the next phase has already begun, and we're just now recognizing the indicators. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't provide easy answers. He didn't suggest simple solutions. He offered warning. What we're watching now is a test of strategic patience. Putin wants to see whether Western resolve will crack before Russian resources exhaust. NATO wants to show that sustained pressure will eventually force Russian recalculation. The United States wants to prevent escalation beyond Ukraine, and Ukraine wants to prevent its destruction becoming a bargaining chip in great power negotiations. Everyone is testing everyone else, our source concluded, and nobody knows how the tests will end. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military activity with unprecedented intensity. They say communications patterns suggest internal debate about next steps. They say logistical movements indicate preparation for sustained operations. And they say Putin's decision to publicly address security officials is likely part of a broader messaging strategy intended to signal both domestic strength and international resolve. But the West is not passive. In fact, Western intelligence has been intensifying its own operations. The response emerging, measured, sustained, and increasingly coordinated, sent a message to Putin that unilateral escalation will not proceed without cost, and it sent a message to allies that the intelligence-sharing architecture remains functional. As the coming weeks unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his recent strategic repositioning. But what we do know is that our source's decision to speak was timely. It exposed gaps that need addressing. It highlighted risks that need acknowledging, and it provided perspective that official channels have been reluctant to share. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next several months. If he escalates further, this moment will be remembered as a warning that went unheeded. If he recalculates, intelligence officials will have demonstrated that transparency can serve strategic purposes. They have shown they are prepared to act. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalibrating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet, and when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully, because tonight Putin learned something he has learned many times before. The West is fractured, but not broken. NATO is strained, but not dissolved, and intelligence, when properly shared, remains a potent tool. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The CIA knows more than it says. The stakes are higher than most realize, and the next phase is already beginning. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next chapter unfolds.